The crystal chandeliers of Carnley's restaurant cast a warm golden glow over the private dining room, their light dancing across white tablecloths adorned with fresh orchids and gleaming silverware. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline twinkled like scattered diamonds against the dark waters of Lake Union. This was the kind of establishment where reservations were made months in advance, where a single dinner could cost more than most people's weekly salary, and where the city's elite gathered to celebrate life's most significant milestones. Tonight, that milestone belonged to Professor Thomas Burns, celebrating 40 years of distinguished service in legal academia. At 65, Tom Burns commanded respect in every room he entered. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored navy suit immaculate despite the evening's festivities. He had built his reputation on brilliant legal scholarship, groundbreaking research in constitutional law, and mentoring generations of lawyers who now worked in prestigious firms across the country. The university had spared no expense for this celebration, bringing together colleagues, former students, and family to honor a man who had shaped the legal minds of an entire generation. The guest list read like a who's who of Seattle's professional elite. Distinguished professors from the university's law school mingled with federal judges, senior partners from major law firms, and successful attorneys who still sought Tom's counsel on complex cases. They discussed landmark court decisions with the same casual ease that others might debate sports scores, their conversations peppered with references to Supreme Court justices and constitutional precedents that would make most people's heads spin. But tonight wasn't just about professional accolades. This was also a family celebration, and the Burns family had gathered in full force to honor their patriarch. Tom's wife, Dr. Margaret Burns, moved gracefully through the room in an elegant emerald dress that complemented her psychology practice's success. As one of Seattle's most sought-after family therapists, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades helping others navigate life's complexities. Her practice was booked months in advance, and her expertise was regularly featured in professional journals and mental health conferences. Their eldest son, Michael Burns, stood near the bar discussing market trends with several venture capitalists. At 35, Michael had already made partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, specializing in corporate mergers and acquisitions. His cases regularly made the business pages of the Seattle Times, and his client list included Fortune 500 companies and tech startups that had grown into billion-dollar enterprises. His wife, Sarah, was a successful pharmaceutical researcher whose work on cancer treatments had earned her recognition in medical journals worldwide. Together, they represented everything the Burns family stood for: intelligence, ambition, and measurable professional achievement. Tom's sister, Allison Crawford, held court near the windows with several university deans. She had retired the previous year as the chief financial officer of a major healthcare system, but her influence in Seattle's business community remained strong. Her husband, Robert, was a federal appellate judge whose decisions shaped legal precedent across the Pacific Northwest. Their children had followed similar paths of conventional success. Their son Sam was a senior analyst at Goldman Sachs, engaged to a Harvard MBA who worked in strategic consulting. Their daughter Emma was completing her residency in cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins, already being recruited by hospitals across the country. The conversation flowed easily among these accomplished individuals, touching on everything from recent Supreme Court decisions to breakthrough medical research to market predictions for the coming quarter. They spoke the language of success fluently, measuring achievements in terms of salary figures, professional rankings, and prestigious affiliations. This was a family that understood the value of education, hard work, and strategic career planning. They had built their lives on solid foundations of professional accomplishment and financial security. And then there was Kaylee. At 30 years old, Kaylee Burns sat quietly at the edge of this gathering, observing the familiar dance of professional networking and family pride. She wore a simple black dress that she had owned for several years, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. While everyone else discussed stock portfolios and career advancement, she nursed a glass of water and tried to make herself invisible. To the casual observer, she might have seemed out of place among these titans of industry and academia, but she belonged here by blood, even if she sometimes felt like she belonged here by little else. Kaylee was the family enigma, the one whose life choices confounded relatives who measured success in terms of professional titles and annual salaries. She had graduated magna cum laude from the University of Washington with a degree in linguistics, achievement that had filled her parents with pride and expectation. Everyone assumed she would follow her family's tradition of pursuing graduate school and building a prestigious career. Law school seemed like the natural choice, given her father's influence and her obvious intelligence. Medical school was another possibility, considering her mother's success in psychology. Business school would have provided a pathway to corporate success like her brother. Instead, Kaylee had chosen poetry. For the past 7 years, she had been writing, crafting verses that explored the complexity of human emotion, the beauty of everyday moments, and the profound truths hidden in ordinary experiences. She maintained a modest lifestyle in a small apartment in Capitol Hill, working as a barista at a local coffee shop to pay her bills while dedicating every spare moment to her craft. She had chosen simplicity over security, creative fulfillment over conventional success, and artistic integrity over financial stability. To her family, this choice represented a waste of potential, a detour from the path that led to real achievement. They loved her, certainly, but they worried about her future in the way that practical people worry about those who choose impractical dreams. They saw her barista job and her small apartment and her dedication to an art form that rarely provided financial security, and they wondered what would become of her when reality inevitably forced her to abandon her romantic notions about making a living through poetry. The irony was that Kaylee understood their concerns perfectly. She had grown up in this world of achievement and recognition. She knew the comfort that came with financial security and professional respect. She had seen how her parents' success had opened doors, provided opportunities, and created a safety net that allowed for both comfort and generosity. She wasn't naive about the challenges of choosing art over conventional career paths. But she also knew something that her family didn't understand, that some people are called to create, that some individuals find their deepest meaning in the pursuit of artistic expression, and that true success sometimes looks very different from what society defines as achievement. She had tried to explain this to them over the years, but the conversations always ended the same way, with gentle but firm suggestions that she consider more practical alternatives to her poetry obsession. As the evening progressed and the conversations grew more animated, Kaylee found herself studying the faces around her. These were genuinely good people who had worked hard for their success and who genuinely wanted the best for her. Their concern came from love, even if it sometimes felt like judgment. They had built their lives on principles of hard work, strategic planning, and measurable achievement, and they worried that her choices were leading her away from the security and respect that they valued so highly. But tonight, as she watched them celebrate her father's remarkable career, Kaylee felt the familiar weight of being the family disappointment. The one whose choices didn't make sense to people who had found success through traditional means. She smiled when spoken to her, nodded at appropriate moments, and prepared herself for the inevitable conversation about her future that seemed to happen at every family gathering. She had learned to navigate these discussions with grace, even when they left her feeling misunderstood and undervalued. What her family didn't know, what she had never told them, was that her quiet persistence was about to change everything. The moment Kaylee had been dreading arrived with the soft click of designer heels on marble flooring. Aunt Allison approached with that practiced smile she used at charity fundraisers, the one that managed to convey both warmth and subtle condescension simultaneously. Behind her followed Uncle Robert, still imposing in his judicial bearing even in casual conversation, and their son Sam, who carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Kaylee, sweetheart," Allison began, her voice dripping with the kind of concern typically reserved for discussing terminal illnesses or natural disasters. You look lovely tonight. Very artistic. The word artistic rolled off her tongue like she was describing a particularly exotic form of mental illness. I love what you've done with your hair. So bohemian. Kaylee touched her ponytail self-consciously, suddenly aware that while everyone else had spent considerable time and money on professional styling, she had simply pulled her hair back with an elastic band she'd found in her car. Thank you, Aunt Allison. You look wonderful too. Now then, Allison continued, settling into the conversation like a prosecutor preparing to present her case. Robert and I were just discussing your situation. We're concerned, dear. Truly concerned about your future. She glanced around the room at the gathering of successful professionals. Look at this room, Kaylee. Look at what your father has built, what your brother has achieved. Don't you want to be part of something like this? Something substantial? Uncle Robert nodded gravely, his judicial temperament lending weight to every word. Kaylee, I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've seen thousands of cases, thousands of people who made choices that seemed romantic at the time but led to financial ruin later. The creative arts. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They're beautiful as hobbies, but they're not reliable foundations for adult life. Sam laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Come on, Dad, let's not be so serious. Kaylee's poetry is cute. Actually, Kaylee, he turned to her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Jenny and I were wondering if you could write something for our wedding. You know, something fun and light. Maybe in the style of Dr. Seuss? Oh, the places you'll go but for marriage? He chuckled at his own cleverness. It would be so much more personal than hiring a real writer. The words hit Kaylee like physical blows. A real writer. As if her years of dedication, her countless hours spent crafting and revising, her deep study of poetic form and literary tradition, was somehow less legitimate than hiring someone to produce verse on demand. She managed a weak smile. I'll think about it, Sam. That's the spirit, Allison beamed. But speaking of thinking, we need to have a serious conversation about your career trajectory. Kaylee, you're 30 years old. 30. When I was your age, I was already a senior analyst at the healthcare system. Robert was arguing cases before the state Supreme Court. Your cousins are building real careers, making real money, contributing to society in meaningful ways. Dr. Margaret Burns, Kaylee's mother, drifted over to join the conversation, her maternal radar having detected the familiar tension that surrounded these family discussions about her younger daughter's future. Allison, please don't lecture Kaylee tonight. This is supposed to be a celebration. Margaret, that's exactly why we need to talk about this, Allison insisted. Look around this room. Look at what success looks like. Tom didn't build this life by pursuing impractical dreams. He worked hard, made smart choices, built something substantial. Kaylee needs to understand that poetry is a lovely hobby, but it's not a career path. Michael Burns approached the growing circle, his successful lawyer instincts sensing an opportunity to mediate what was clearly becoming a family intervention. What's the discussion here? Everything okay? We're trying to help Kaylee see some practical alternatives to her current situation, Robert explained diplomatically. She's incredibly intelligent, clearly creative, but she needs to channel those gifts into something more sustainable. Like what? Kaylee asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. She had heard variations of this conversation at every family gathering for the past 7 years. Well, Allison brightened, clearly pleased to have been asked for her expertise. There are so many options for someone with your background. Editorial work, for instance. Publishing houses are always looking for editors with strong language skills. Or copywriting. The tech industry here in Seattle is booming, and they need creative writers for marketing materials. Or teaching, added Sarah, Michael's wife, joining the conversation with the confident smile of someone whose own career was unquestionably successful. You could get your teaching certificate, work in the school system. English teachers are always in demand, and you'd have summers off to pursue your poetry as a hobby. The school district has excellent benefits, Robert noted approvingly. Health insurance, retirement planning, job security. All the things that matter for long-term stability. Sam nodded enthusiastically. Or you could do freelance writing. I know several people who make decent money writing website content, blog posts, social media stuff. It's not exactly literature, but it would pay the bills while you figure out what you really want to do with your life. The phrase, what you really want to do with your life, hung in the air like an accusation. As of 7 years of dedication to her craft, 7 years of honing her voice and developing her artistic vision, 7 years of choosing creation over conventional success, somehow didn't count as knowing what she wanted to do with her life. Those are all thoughtful suggestions, Kaylee said carefully, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. I appreciate that you're thinking about my future. We just want to see you succeed, dear, Allison said, reaching over to pat Kaylee's hand in a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and patronizing. You're so talented, so intelligent. It breaks our hearts to see you wasting those gifts on something so uncertain. Poetry isn't exactly a growth industry, as Sam added with another laugh. I mean, when was the last time you heard about someone getting rich writing poems? Even famous poets usually have day jobs. Emma Crawford, Allison's daughter and Sam's sister, approached from the dessert table where she had been discussing her surgical residency with several medical professionals. At 28, she was already being courted by prestigious hospitals across the country, her future as bright and secure as anyone could hope for. What are we discussing over here? You all look very serious. We're trying to help Kaylee understand the importance of career planning, her mother explained. She's been writing poetry for years now, and while it's lovely as a creative outlet, she needs to think about building something more substantial. Emma nodded sympathetically. Kaylee, I remember when you used to write those beautiful pieces in college. You're genuinely talented. But talent alone isn't enough in the real world. You need strategy, planning, professional development. Have you considered technical writing? Medical writing? The pharmaceutical industry is always looking for people who can translate complex information into accessible language. Or grant writing, suggested Dr. Margaret Burns, her therapist training making her naturally diplomatic even when delivering difficult truths. Nonprofits need skilled writers to help them secure funding. It would use your creative abilities in a practical way while serving a good cause. The suggestions kept coming, each one delivered with genuine care and complete misunderstanding of what drove Kaylee's artistic passion. They were trying to find ways to make her creativity practical, to channel her obvious intelligence into something that will provide the security and recognition that they valued so highly. They saw her choices not as dedication to craft, but as an extended adolescence that needed to be gently guided toward responsible adulthood. Tom Burns himself eventually made his way over to the growing circle of concerned relatives. Even at his own celebration, he couldn't resist the gravitational pull of a family discussion about practical life decisions. His presence immediately elevated the conversation from casual advice-giving to serious family intervention. What's capturing everyone's attention over here? He asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the topic. I hope you're not giving our guest of honor any trouble, he added with a slight smile toward Kaylee. Dad, we're just discussing Kaylee's future, Michael explained. Everyone's offering some career suggestions that might help her use her writing talents more strategically. Tom nodded slowly, his legal training making him naturally methodical in his approach to problem-solving. Kaylee, your mother and I have had this conversation many times. We're not opposed to creativity. Art and literature have important places in society. But they're not reliable foundations for adult life. They're enrichments, enhancements, hobbies that successful people pursue after they've built security through practical careers. Look at your cousin Emma, Allison added. She writes poetry too, but she's also building a medical career. She understands the importance of having a primary profession that provides stability while pursuing creative interests on the side. I publish my poems in the hospital newsletter, Emma said proudly. The staff loves them. It's a wonderful outlet, but I would never consider it my main career focus. The comparison stung more than Kaylee cared to admit. Here was her cousin, successful and respected, who treated poetry as a charming side bow to her real life. The implication was clear. Poetry was fine as long as you didn't take it too seriously, as long as you understood that it was supplementary to the important business of building a respectable career. Kaylee, her father continued, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex legal concepts to struggling students, writing is a beautiful gift. But gifts need to be channeled productively. You can't build a family on poetry. You can't plan for retirement on verses. You can't provide security for future children on the hope that someone will publish your work. Dad's right, and Michael added gently. Sarah and I have been talking about this. If you're serious about writing, there are practical ways to pursue it. Technical writing for tech companies, content creation for marketing firms, educational material development. These are growing fields that would value your skills while providing real income and benefits. The weight of their collective concern was almost overwhelming. These people who loved her, who wanted the best for her, who genuinely believed they were helping by trying to steer her toward conventional success. They couldn't see that their practical advice felt like a betrayal of everything she held dear, that their suggestions to make her art practical missed the point entirely. I understand your concerns, Kaylee said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I really do. And I appreciate that you're thinking about my future. Then you'll consider some of these alternatives? Allison asked hopefully. Maybe start with part-time freelance work while you transition away from the coffee shop? Kaylee looked around the circle of expectant faces, these successful, accomplished people who measured her worth by their own standards and found her lacking. She felt the familiar burning sensation in her chest, the mix of hurt and frustration that came from being perpetually misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know her best. I think, she said quietly, setting down her water glass and reaching for her purse, I should probably head home. I have an early shift tomorrow. Oh, Kaylee, you don't have to leave early, her mother protested. We're just trying to help. I know you are, Mom. And I love you all for caring about me. But I'm tired, and I think it's better if I go. As she made her way toward the exit, Kaylee could hear the conversation continuing behind her, her relatives discussing her situation with the earnest concern of people trying to solve a problem they didn't fully understand. She knew they would spend the rest of the evening wondering what to do about her, how to help her see reason, how to guide her toward the kind of success they understood and valued. What they didn't know was that she had already found her own definition of success. They just weren't ready to understand what that looked like. What they also didn't know was the story of the past 5 years, the story Kaylee had never shared because she understood that her family needed to see external validation before they could appreciate internal achievement. It was a story that began with a simple decision to start a poetry blog, a small act of faith in her own voice that had grown into something none of them could have imagined. 5 years earlier, on a rainy Tuesday evening in her cramped Capitol Hill apartment, Kaylee had created a WordPress blog called A Words After Rain. The name came from a line in one of her poems about how the world looks different after a storm, how rain washes away the familiar and reveals hidden beauty in ordinary things. She had no expectations beyond creating a space to share her work and perhaps connect with other poets who understood the compulsion to capture human experience in verse. Her first post received 3 views, her own, plus 2 from what appeared to be spam bots. The second post did slightly better with 7 views, one of which generated her first real comment, a beautiful imagery. Thank you for sharing. It was signed by someone named Maria in Portland, and Kaylee had stared at those 4 words for nearly an hour, amazed that her poetry had reached across the digital void to touch another human being. Those early months were a lesson in persistence and faith. Kaylee would finish her 8-hour shifts at the coffee shop, her feet aching and her clothes smelling of espresso and steamed milk, then climb the narrow stairs to her apartment and transform into a different version of herself. She would make a simple dinner, usually pasta or soup, then settle at her small desk beside the window that looked out over the alley behind her building. The writing happened in the quiet hours when the city settled into sleep around her. She would light a single candle, open her laptop, and let the words flow onto the screen. Some nights the poetry came easily, spilling out in complete verses that seemed to write themselves. Other nights, she would struggle for hours to capture a single image, a particular feeling, a moment of truth that demanded precise language to convey its meaning. Her blog posts went up every Tuesday and Friday, a schedule she maintained with religious devotion even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her dedication. She wrote about everything: the elderly man who came into the coffee shop every morning and ordered the same drink while reading letters from his deceased wife, the way rain transforms Seattle streets into rivers of reflected light, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't understand your dreams, the small moments of beauty that most people miss in their rush toward conventional success. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her readership began to grow. Maria in Portland became a regular commenter, joined by David in Toronto, then Sarah in London, then dozens of others from around the world who found something in Kaylee's words that spoke to their own experiences. Her subscriber count crept upward, 50 followers, then 100, then 500. Each new subscriber felt like a small miracle, validation that her words were reaching people who needed to hear them. By the end of her first year, Words After Rain had attracted nearly 2,000 regular readers. Kaylee began receiving emails from people sharing how her poetry had helped them through difficult times: a divorce, the death of a parent, the struggle of feeling misunderstood by family. A teacher in Ohio wrote to tell her that she had read one of Kaylee's poems to her high school English class, and for the first time all semester, her students had engaged in meaningful discussion about literature. The second year brought unexpected opportunities. A small literary magazine in Vancouver requested permission to republish one of her poems. Then a poetry podcast in Australia featured her work in an episode about emerging voices in contemporary verse. Her blog's reach expanded beyond North America to include readers in Europe, Asia, and South America. Comments arrived in multiple languages, with readers attempting to translate their appreciation into English or simply posting heart emojis when words failed them. During her third year of blogging, something shifted. Kaylee's poetry was maturing, growing more sophisticated and emotionally resonant. She had found her unique voice, a style that combined accessible language with profound emotional depth. Her poems could make readers laugh and cry within the same verse, finding humor in heartbreak and tragedy in everyday moments. Critics would later describe her work as having the rare ability to make the universal feel personal and the personal feel universal. The breakthrough came during her 4th year, when Kaylee made the decision to compile her best blog posts into a digital collection. She spent months selecting and revising poems, organizing them into thematic sections, and designing a simple but elegant ebook format. She called the collection A Fractured Light: Poems for the Almost Broken, Erin self-published it through Amazon's Kindle platform for $4.99. The first week's sales were modest, 37 copies, mostly purchased by her most loyal blog followers. But then something unexpected happened. Readers began leaving reviews, and those reviews were extraordinary. 5-star ratings accompanied by lengthy comments about how the poems had touched their lives, how Kaylee's words had given voice to feelings they couldn't express themselves, how her collection had become a source of comfort during difficult times. Word of mouth spread through social media and online poetry communities. Book bloggers began featuring A Fractured Light in their recommendations. Poetry enthusiasts shared favorite verses on Instagram and Twitter. Within 6 months, the collection had sold over 8,000 copies across 40 countries, generating income that exceeded Kaylee's annual salary from the coffee shop. The success of her first digital collection gave Kaylee the confidence to publish a second, A Ordinary Sacred, Finding the Divine in Daily Life. This collection focused on the spiritual dimensions of everyday experience, exploring how moments of transcendence could be found in the most mundane activities. The poems drew from her observations during her coffee shop shifts, the way morning light streamed through the windows, the ritual of creating the perfect espresso, the brief connections formed with regular customers who shared fragments of their lives over daily caffeine fixes. Ordinary Sacred was an even greater success, selling 12,000 copies in its first year and establishing Kaylee as a significant voice in contemporary digital poetry. Her blog readership had grown to over 12,000 subscribers, and her social media presence attracted poetry lovers from around the world. She was invited to participate in online poetry festivals, virtual readings, and collaborative projects with other emerging writers. But the real breakthrough came 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Kaylee was working the opening shift at the coffee shop, preparing for the morning rush, when her phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. The sender was Amanda Richardson, Senior Acquisitions Editor at Meridian Press, one of New York's most prestigious independent publishing houses. Ms. Burns, the email began, I've been following your work through your blog and digital collections for the past year. Your poetry demonstrates a rare combination of accessibility and depth that we find exceptional. I would like to discuss the possibility of Meridian Press publishing a print collection of your work. Would you be available for a phone conversation this week? Kaylee had to read the email 3 times before its meaning fully sank in. Meridian Press was the kind of publisher that poets dreamed about, the house that had launched the careers of Pulitzer Prize winners and National Book Award recipients. Their poetry list was small and highly curated, representing only the most promising voices in contemporary literature. The fact that they had found her work, that they were interested in publishing her, seemed almost impossible to believe. The phone conversation with Amanda Richardson lasted 2 hours and covered everything from Kaylee's artistic vision to her long-term career goals to the specific poems she might include in a print collection. Amanda was impressed not only by Kaylee's poetry but by her professionalism, her understanding of the literary marketplace, and her realistic expectations about the challenges facing contemporary poets. 3 weeks later, Kaylee found herself on a plane to New York, walking into the offices of Meridian Press for a meeting that felt like stepping into a dream. The building was everything she had imagined, shelves lined with books by authors she had studied and admired, walls decorated with awards and accolades, the quiet hum of an organization dedicated to bringing meaningful literature to the world. The contract negotiation was surreal. Meridian Press was offering an advance that exceeded her annual income from the coffee shop, along with a marketing budget that would support book tours, media interviews, and promotional campaigns. They wanted to publish not just one collection, but potentially a series of books that would establish Kaylee as a major voice in American poetry. But perhaps most importantly, they understood her vision. Amanda Richardson and the editorial team at Meridian Press weren't trying to make her poetry more commercial or more accessible. They appreciated her work exactly as it was, recognizing that her ability to find profound meaning in ordinary experience was precisely what made her voice distinctive and valuable. The signing ceremony was simple but profound. Kaylee sat in a conference room overlooking Madison Avenue, surrounded by editors and marketing professionals who spoke about her work with the kind of respect she had always hoped for but never dared to expect. When she signed her name to the contract, she felt like she was finally stepping into the identity she had been building in secret for so many years. The months that followed were a whirlwind of editorial collaboration and preparation. Kaylee worked with Meridian's editorial team to select and arrange the poems for her debut collection, which they decided to title After Rain, Words Remain. The title captured both the essence of her blog and the themes that ran through her best work: the idea that language could preserve and transform experience, that poetry could find meaning in aftermath and loss, that words could remain when everything else had been washed away. The editorial process was more intensive than anything Kaylee had experienced with her digital collections. Every poem was examined line by line, every word choice questioned and refined. But rather than feeling restrictive, the collaboration pushed her to new levels of precision and artistry. She was working with professionals who understood poetry not just as emotional expression but as crafted art, and their expertise helped her see her own work with new clarity. Meanwhile, Meridian's marketing team was building anticipation for the collection's release. They arranged for advance reviews in major literary journals, secured interviews with influential poetry podcasts, and planned a book tour that would take Kaylee to independent bookstores and university campuses across the country. The advance buzz was better than anyone had dared hope, with early readers comparing her work to established masters of contemporary verse. As the publication date approached, Kaylee continued working at the coffee shop, maintaining the routine that had sustained her through years of artistic development. Her family remained unaware of the transformation that was about to occur, still viewing her as their struggling artist daughter who needed guidance and intervention. She had considered telling them about the book deal, but something held her back. She wanted to see if they could learn to respect her choices before they learned about her success. The release of After Rain, Words Remain on a crisp October morning changed everything. Within 24 hours, the first printing of 15,000 copies had sold out completely. Independent bookstores across the country reported customers asking specifically for Kaylee's collection, many of them longtime followers of her blog who had been waiting years to hold her words in physical form. The emotional connection readers felt to her digital work translated powerfully to print, creating a demand that surprised even Meridian Press's experienced marketing team. The reviews began appearing within the first week, and they were everything a debut poet could hope for. The Washington Post called her work luminous and essential, poetry that makes the everyday feel sacred without losing sight of life's genuine struggles. The New York Review of Books praised her rare ability to find profound meaning in ordinary moments while maintaining absolute honesty about the complexity of human experience. Most significantly, Poetry Magazine, the most prestigious publication in American verse, featured her collection as their lead review, describing Kaylee as a vital new voice that reminds us why poetry matters in an increasingly disconnected world. But the real vindication came 3 weeks after publication, when After Rain, Words Remain appeared on the New York Times bestseller list for poetry. Kaylee was at work when Amanda Richardson called with the news, and she had to excuse herself to the storage room to process the reality that her small press poetry collection had achieved the kind of commercial success that most publishers only dreamed of. The irony wasn't lost on her that she received this life-changing news while wearing a coffee-stained apron and surrounded by boxes of paper cups. The international interest began almost immediately. Publishers from around the world reached out to Meridian Press seeking translation rights, recognizing that Kaylee's themes of finding meaning in ordinary experience were universal enough to transcend cultural boundaries. The first international deal came from Editions Gallimard in France, the prestigious house that had published everyone from Marcel Proust to Annie Ernaux. They offered a substantial advance for French translation rights, viewing Kaylee's work as representative of a new generation of American poets who could speak to global audiences. Japan followed quickly, with Shinchosher Publishing expressing particular interest in Kaylee's poems about solitude and introspection, themes that resonated deeply with contemporary Japanese readers. The translator they assigned was a respected poet in her own right, someone who had won awards for her English to Japanese literary translations. When Kaylee received the preliminary translations, she was amazed to see how her words had been transformed while maintaining their essential meaning, how her American voice had found new life in a completely different linguistic tradition. Poland's Znak Publishing House approached Meridian Press with what they called an unusual urgency about acquiring translation rights. Polish readers, they explained, had discovered Kaylee's work through her blog and were creating their own underground translations, sharing her poems in literary forums and university poetry circles. The official translation, they insisted, needed to happen quickly to meet the growing demand. Within 6 months of publication, Year After Rain, Words Remain was being translated into 19 languages, from Spanish and German to Korean and Arabic. Each translation brought new readers who connected with Kaylee's exploration of universal themes through distinctly personal experience. Her poetry was being read in cafes in Paris, discussed in literature classes in Tokyo, and quoted in wedding ceremonies in Warsaw. The speaking invitations began arriving in her inbox like a daily avalanche. Universities across the country wanted her to read her work and discuss contemporary poetry with students who saw her as proof that artistic careers were still possible in the modern world. Her first major reading was at UC Berkeley, where she stood before an audience of 300 students and faculty members, many of whom had discovered her work years earlier through her blog. The response was overwhelming, with students lining up afterward to have their copies signed and to share how her poems had influenced their own writing. Harvard invited her to spend a week as a visiting poet, conducting workshops and delivering a lecture on a digital poetry and the democratization of literature. Yale followed with a similar invitation, as did Stanford, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. Each appearance generated new readers, new admirers, and new opportunities. Academic conferences began featuring panels on her work, with literature professors analyzing her techniques and discussing her influence on contemporary verse. The media attention was equally intense, but required a different kind of navigation. National Public Radio featured her in a segment about the resurgence of poetry in American culture, interviewing her about how social media and digital platforms had created new opportunities for poets to reach audiences directly. The conversation lasted an hour, with Kaylee discussing everything from her writing process to her thoughts on poetry's role in helping people process difficult emotions. Podcast invitations flooded in from literary shows, cultural programs, and even mainstream interview platforms that typically focused on celebrities and business leaders. The Poetry Hour dedicated an entire episode to reading and analyzing her work. Fresh Air invited her for a conversation about how contemporary poets were using digital platforms to build sustainable careers. Most surprisingly, at the Tim Ferriss Show wanted to interview her about the business side of building an audience through content creation, viewing her success as a case study in how artists could leverage technology to bypass traditional gatekeepers. Her blog, which had been the foundation of everything, experienced explosive growth. The publication of her book drove thousands of new readers to a Words After Rain, where they could access years of her earlier work and follow her ongoing creative development. Her subscriber count jumped from 12,000 to over 60,000 in the months following publication, then continued climbing toward 150,000 as media coverage introduced her to ever-widening audiences. The financial transformation was as dramatic as the artistic recognition. Her book advance had already exceeded her annual coffee shop salary, but the ongoing royalties from both domestic and international sales created a level of financial security she had never experienced. For the first time in her adult life, Kaylee wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, wasn't calculating whether she could afford both groceries and utilities in the same week. More importantly, the success gave her the freedom to take creative risks. She quit her job at the coffee shop, a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time since college, her days belonged entirely to her writing. She could follow inspiration wherever it led, experiment with new forms and themes, and dedicate the time and energy that serious artistic work demanded. With this newfound freedom, Kaylee launched an ambitious new project, an online platform called the Emerging Voices, designed to support other poets who were trying to build audiences and develop their craft. The platform offered workshops, mentorship opportunities, and publication possibilities for writers who couldn't access traditional literary networks. She partnered with established poets and editors to create a comprehensive resource that addressed everything from the technical aspects of writing to the business realities of building a literary career. The platform attracted attention from major literary organizations, including PEN America, which invited Kaylee to join their board of directors for emerging writers. At 30 years old, she found herself participating in conversations about the future of American literature alongside poets and authors whose work she had studied in college. She was consulted about grant programs, literary awards, and initiatives designed to support diverse voices in contemporary writing. Universities began incorporating her work into their curricula. Harvard's English department added several of her poems to their contemporary literature syllabus. The University of Iowa's prestigious Writers' Workshop invited her to serve as a visiting lecturer, an honor typically reserved for poets with decades of experience and multiple published collections. High school teachers across the country began using her accessible but sophisticated poems to introduce students to contemporary verse, finding that her work bridged the gap between classical poetry and modern sensibilities. The recognition extended beyond academic circles. After Rain, Words Remain, he was nominated for the National Book Award for Poetry, placing Kaylee among the most celebrated poets of her generation. While she didn't win, the nomination generated significant media coverage and introduced her work to readers who might never have encountered contemporary poetry otherwise. The ceremony itself was surreal, sitting among writers she had admired for years, being recognized as their peer in the literary community. Major magazines and newspapers began featuring her work regularly. The New Yorker published 3 of her poems in a special issue on emerging American voices. The Atlantic commissioned an essay about her experience building a literary career in the digital age, which became one of their most shared articles of the year. Her appearance on the cover of Poets and Writers magazine marked a moment when she truly understood that she had moved from emerging writer to established voice in contemporary literature. Through all of this success, Kaylee maintained her modest lifestyle and her connection to the values that had sustained her through years of uncertainty. She moved to a slightly larger apartment, one with better natural light for writing, but she avoided the trappings of literary celebrity that some authors embraced. Her wardrobe remained simple, her car remained practical, and her daily routine remained focused on the work itself rather than the recognition it was generating. The most meaningful aspect of her success wasn't the awards or the sales figures or the international recognition. It was the constant stream of messages from readers whose lives had been touched by her words. Teachers who used her poems to help students through difficult times. Therapists who recommended her work to clients struggling with depression or anxiety. Ordinary people who found comfort, inspiration, or simply a sense of being understood in her exploration of human experience. As her father's 70th birthday approached, Kaylee faced a familiar dilemma. Her family continued to view her as their underachieving daughter, the one whose life choices worried them and whose future remained uncertain in their minds. They had no idea about the book's success, the international recognition, the literary awards, or the platform she had built for supporting other writers. They still saw the coffee shop barista who wrote poetry as a hobby, not the established author whose work was being studied in universities and translated into dozens of languages. The birthday celebration would be another family gathering, another opportunity for well-meaning relatives to express their concerns about her choices and offer practical alternatives to her artistic pursuits. Kaylee had grown accustomed to these conversations, had learned to navigate them with grace and patience even when they left her feeling fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know her best. But this time would be different. This time, The truth about her quiet success was about to collide with her family's assumptions in ways that none of them could anticipate. 8 months after that awkward anniversary dinner, the Burns family gathered once again, this time at the elegant Fairmorn Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle to celebrate Tom's 70th birthday. The private dining room overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries moved like illuminated toys across the dark water. The celebration was smaller and more intimate than the anniversary party, limited to immediate family and Tom's closest colleagues from the university. Kaylee arrived quietly, as was her custom, wearing dark jeans and a simple sweater that she had purchased at a discount store. She carried a small wrapped gift and a worn copy of a poetry collection by Mary Oliver, her reading material for the evening's quieter moments. To anyone observing the family dynamic, she appeared to be exactly what she had always been, the underachieving daughter whose life choices continued to puzzle and concern her successful relatives. The conversation patterns were depressingly familiar. Aunt Allison immediately zeroed in on Kaylee's appearance, commenting with false brightness about her casual style and asking whether she was still working at that little coffee shop. Cousin Sam, now married and working as a senior analyst, made jokes about whether Kaylee had written any real poetry lately or if she was still playing around with those blog posts that nobody reads. Kaylee's situation hasn't changed much, a Dr. Margaret Burns explained to a colleague's wife who had asked about her daughter's careers. She's still exploring her creative interests, but we're hoping she'll eventually decide to pursue something more sustainable. Michael Burns, now a named partner at his law firm, approached Kaylee with the patronizing smile that had become his default expression when discussing her life choices. Still writing poetry, Kaylee? That's dedication. I'll give you that. Most people would have moved on to something more practical by now. The arts are important, he added his wife Sarah, her tone carrying the kind of diplomatic condescension typically reserved for discussing children's finger painting. But there's a difference between appreciating poetry and trying to make it a career. Have you given any more thought to those teaching positions we discussed? The school district is still hiring. Emma Crawford, now Dr. Emma Crawford, having completed her surgical residency, joined the conversation with the confidence of someone whose career trajectory had never been questioned. Kaylee, I've been thinking about your situation since Dad's anniversary party. Have you considered medical writing? Pharmaceutical companies need people who can translate complex information into accessible language. It would use your writing skills in a practical application. The suggestions came with mechanical predictability, each family member offering their version of how Kaylee could make her creativity practical, how she could channel her obvious intelligence into something that would provide the security and recognition they valued. The underlying message remained unchanged. Poetry was a charming hobby that needed to be abandoned in favor of responsible adulthood. Tom Burns listened to the conversation with the measured attention he brought to all family discussions, occasionally nodding when someone made what he considered a particularly valid point. Finally, he decided to contribute his own perspective, drawing on 7 decades of life experience and professional wisdom. Kaylee, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in lecture halls for 40 years, your family loves you, and we want to see you succeed. But success requires more than talent. It requires strategic thinking, practical planning, and realistic assessment of market opportunities. Poetry is a beautiful art form, but it's not a viable career path for 99% of people who pursue it. Dad's absolutely right, Allison chimed in. We're not trying to crush your creativity, dear. We're trying to help you understand that creativity needs to be balanced with practicality. Look around this room. Everyone here has built their success on solid foundations. Legal careers, medical careers, business achievements. These are the parts that lead to real security and respect. And it's not too late, Robert added with judicial certainty. You're only 30. People change careers all the time. Your linguistics background would be valuable in several fields. translation services, technical writing, corporate communications. You could even go back to school for a master's degree in something more marketable. A familiar burning sensation rose in Kaylee's chest, the mix of frustration and hurt that came from being perpetually misunderstood by people who claimed to know what was best for her. She was about to excuse herself early once again when a commotion near the dining room entrance interrupted the conversation. The maître d' was escorting a distinguished woman in an expensive grey suit through the crowded restaurant. Even from across the room, the woman's presence commanded attention. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to important meetings and significant decisions, scanning the private dining room with the focused intensity of someone looking for a specific person. When her eyes found Kaylee, her face lit up with genuine pleasure and relief. She began making her way through the crowd of surprised family members with purposeful determination, clearly having found exactly who she was looking for. "Oh no," Kaylee whispered under her breath, recognizing Amanda Richardson despite the distance and the unexpected context. "Ms. Burns," Amanda's voice carried across the dining room as she approached their group, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone within hearing distance. "There you are. I've been trying to reach you all day. I have extraordinary news about your collection." The circle of family members parted automatically as Amanda reached them, her professional authority creating a space of respectful silence. At 55, Amanda Richardson was a legend in the publishing world, a woman whose editorial decisions had shaped contemporary American literature for over 2 decades. Her endorsement could launch careers, and her presence at any literary event signified that something important was happening. "Ms. Richardson," Kaylee said quietly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "This really isn't the best time. It's my father's birthday celebration." "Nonsense," Amanda exclaimed, her enthusiasm bubbling over despite Kaylee's obvious discomfort. "This news absolutely cannot wait. The international sales figures are in, and they're unprecedented for a debut poetry collection. We've sold translation rights to 37 countries now, including deals with the most prestigious literary houses in Europe and Asia." The silence that followed was so complete that the sounds of the restaurant's kitchen seemed to echo through the dining room. Every face in the family circle had gone slack with confusion and dawning realization. Uncle Robert's wine glass trembled in his hand. Aunt Allison's mouth had fallen open in a most undignified expression of shock. "I'm sorry," a Dr. Margaret Burns said weakly. "Did you say international sales?" Amanda turned to Kaylee's mother with a radiant smile, clearly delighted to meet the family of one of her most successful authors. "Oh, you must be Kaylee's mother. How wonderful to meet you. Yes, international sales." After Rain, Words Remain has become a global phenomenon. We're approaching 500,000 copies sold worldwide, which is extraordinary for any poetry collection, let alone a debut. 500,000, a Michael's voice cracked slightly. Copies of poetry books. And that's just the beginning, Amanda continued cheerfully, oblivious to the shell-shocked expressions surrounding her. Netflix has optioned the collection for a limited series adaptation. They're planning to create an anthology show where each episode is inspired by one of Kaylee's poems. The deal is worth $12 million, with Kaylee serving as executive producer and creative consultant. "Netflix," Sam repeated numbly. $12 million. Amanda consulted her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be an endless list of updates and opportunities. The academic recognition has been equally impressive. Harvard has added 4 of Kaylee's poems to their required reading list for contemporary American literature. Yale is planning a symposium on her work next spring. The University of Iowa wants to offer her a permanent position as poet in residence, though I advised her to wait until after the Pulitzer Prize announcements before making any long-term commitments. "Pulitzer Prize," Emmer whispered, her surgical precision with language finally failing her. Well, she's been nominated, Eamander clarified. Along with the National Book Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Griffin Poetry Prize. Quite remarkable for a first collection. The literary establishment has embraced her work in ways we rarely see for emerging poets. Tom Burns, who had spent decades analyzing complex legal documents and parsing intricate arguments, found himself struggling to process the information being delivered about his daughter's secret life. Eamander, is it? I'm Tom Burns, Kaylee's father. Are you saying that my daughter, who works as a barrister, has written a book that sold 500,000 copies? Worked as a barrister, Eamander corrected gently. Kaylee left the coffee shop months ago to focus on her writing full-time. And yes, her collection has been one of our most successful publications in recent memory. The New York Times kept it on their bestseller list for 16 consecutive weeks, which is almost unheard of for poetry. But we had no idea, Allison said faintly. She never mentioned any of this. We thought she was just, writing blog posts. Eamander looked puzzled by the family's obvious shock. Kaylee's blog has over 150,000 subscribers worldwide. Her work is being studied in universities across the country. She's been invited to read at the Kennedy Center, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian. Last month, PEN America elected her to their board of directors, making her the youngest poet ever to serve in that capacity. PEN America, Robert said slowly, his judicial mind finally beginning to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. That's the writers' organization that defends free speech and literary freedom worldwide. The very same, Eamander confirmed. They recognize that Kaylee represents the future of American poetry. Her ability to reach diverse audiences while maintaining artistic integrity is exactly what contemporary literature needs. Kaylee watched her family's faces cycle through shock, confusion, and dawning understanding. These people who had spent years worrying about her future, offering practical alternatives to her impractical dreams, were slowly realizing that she had built exactly the kind of success they valued, just not in the form they had expected. The platform she launched for emerging writers has already helped launch 12 other poets' careers, Eamander continued. 3 of them have signed with major publishers, and 5 have won significant literary awards. Kaylee's influence on contemporary poetry extends far beyond her own work. She launched a platform, Michael repeated, his lawyer's mind finally beginning to grasp the scope of what his sister had accomplished. 4 other writers. The Emerging Voices platform has become essential infrastructure for contemporary poetry, Eamander explained. Major publishers use it to scout talent, universities recommend it to their students, and established poets volunteer as mentors. Kaylee has created something that didn't exist before, something the literary community desperately needed. The weight of their collective misunderstanding was settling over the family like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to realize that their concern for Kaylee's future had been based on fundamental ignorance about what she had actually been building during all those years they thought she was wasting her potential. Eamander checked her watch and smiled apologetically. I really must run, Kaylee. The documentary crew from PBS needs confirmation about next week's filming schedule. They're incredibly excited about the behind-the-scenes piece on your creative process. She turned to the stunned family members. It was lovely meeting you all. You must be so proud of Kaylee's achievements. She's become one of the most important voices in contemporary American literature. As Amanda Richardson disappeared back into the Seattle night, the family remained frozen in various states of shock and dawning comprehension. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with the weight of years of misplaced concern and misguided advice. Kaylee, Tom's voice was barely audible, all his professional authority stripped away by the magnitude of his misunderstanding. Is this real? Everything she said? Yes, Dad. It's real. But why didn't you tell us? Margaret Burns asked, her therapist training failing her as she struggled to process her own daughter's secret success. Why did you let us worry about you? Let us think you were struggling? Kaylee looked around at the faces of people she loved, people whose approval she had craved her entire life, people who had just discovered that their definition of success had blinded them to her actual achievements. Because I wanted to know that you loved and respected me for who I am, not for what I've accomplished. I wanted to know that your approval wasn't contingent on external validation. The truth of that statement hit them like a physical force. They realized that their love had become conditional, tied to their own narrow definitions of success and respectability. They had been so focused on what Kaylee's life looked like from the outside that they had completely missed what she was building on the inside. Kaylee, Allison's voice was thick with emotion. I owe you the most profound apology. We all do. We've been so condescending, so dismissive of your work, so certain that we knew better than you did about your own life. We were trying to help, Robert added quietly, his judicial certainty replaced by humility. But we were measuring your success by our own standards instead of understanding yours. Michael shook his head in amazement. All those times I suggested you find a real job, and you were already building something more successful than anything I've achieved in law. I feel like such an idiot. Success isn't a competition, Kaylee said gently. Your legal career is impressive and important. You've helped people, built something meaningful. But success doesn't have to look the same for everyone. But we made you feel like a failure, Emma said, tears forming in her eyes. We made you feel like your choices were wrong, like your passion was just a phase you needed to grow out of. You were worried about someone you love, Kaylee replied. That comes from a good place, even when the expression of that worry is hurtful. I understand that you were scared for my future because you care about me. Tom Burns stood slowly, his 70 years suddenly visible in the way he moved toward his daughter. Kaylee, can you forgive us? Can you forgive us for being so narrow-minded, so unable to see the extraordinary thing you were building right in front of us? There's nothing to forgive, Dad. Family means wanting the best for each other, even when we disagree about what best looks like. But we were wrong, and Margaret insisted. Completely, embarrassingly wrong. You found your path, and it led to something we never could have imagined. We should have trusted you. We should have believed that if anyone could make it work, it would be you. The reconciliation that followed was more emotional than any of them had anticipated. Years of misunderstanding dissolved as they talked openly about assumptions, expectations, and the courage it takes to pursue unconventional dreams. The family that had gathered to celebrate Tom's professional achievements ended up learning something far more important about success, passion, and the danger of measuring other people's lives by your own limited definitions. 3 months later, when After Rain, Words Remain you won the National Book Award for Poetry, the entire Burns family was in the audience at the ceremony in New York. They had become Kaylee's biggest supporters, using their own professional networks to promote her work and advocate for poetry's importance in contemporary culture. But the real victory wasn't the award or the sales figures or the international recognition. It was the understanding that had grown between them, the acceptance that success comes in many forms and that love should never be conditional on achievement. They had learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions, to support dreams instead of dismissing them, and to measure success by fulfillment rather than external validation. And Kaylee had learned something equally important, that sometimes the people who love you most need to see your achievements recognized by the outside world before they can fully appreciate the courage it took to build them. It wasn't ideal, but it was human, and understanding that humanity had made forgiveness not just possible, but inevitable. The moral of her story wasn't about proving doubters wrong or achieving success for its own sake. It was about the quiet persistence required to follow your authentic path.